Okay, welcome to the last one of our lectures. This is going to be chapter 14. This will kind of give us a wrap up and a conclusion of the course, and I will talk a little bit about um, some general themes I think came out of the course as well. Um, so let's jump in and take this. This lecture will not be as long necessarily as the others, at least I hope. We'll see how I do. Okay. First of all, as part of a recurring theory of our course, we had talked about the conflict, multiple conflicts between the idea of due process, treating people fairly, and crime control, keeping the crime rate down. Well, kind of another way of looking at this is a conflict between the idea of security and liberty or freedom, and those words are used very inexactly. So you cannot have a completely free society, neither can you have a completely secure society. And each country, each people have to decide how far they want to go, both in granting people liberty or recognizing people have liberty, because you could make the argument that you only surrender rights to the state. The state does not have the right to take rights from you. By state, I'm referring to any form of government. So one of the things that's clearly happened in the 20th century is a rise in the ability of the state, the government, to both conduct surveillance upon its own populations and maintain greater control over them. So in the United States, one of the illustrations of this is the rise of what is sometimes called the national security state. And you can trace some of this back to the Foreign Intelligence Service Act. This was passed in 1978, And what it did was set up initially, and this was kind of at the height of the Cold War, the beginning of the ramping up the Cold War. The Russian-Afghanistan invasion is just a year or so away. The passage of the Foreign Intelligence Service Act allowed federal agents, primarily the FBI, to eavesdrop on communication of foreign persons and foreign entities without a court order for up to 1 year, so long as it was national security. It was even broader than that, in that the FISA Act, as it's called, FISA, FISA, Foreign Intelligence Service Act, allowed a surveillance of American civilians as well, if they were communicating or thought to be communicating with foreign agents. Again, primarily this was aimed at the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, much of this was redirected to other potential security threats. At first, the communist China, then primarily Islamic terrorists or Islamic terrorist networks. Also, the terrorist 9/11 attack really gave a great deal of support to greater security. Less freedom, more security. So after 9/11, we have the passage of the Patriot Act, which allowed the government to do things that it never could have done prior to 9/11. I think also what's happening here is a rise of a government reaction to technology. If we think back to 9/11 and the late 20th century, early 2000s, we really were in the beginning of this sort of social information age where people shared, at this point, bulletin boards, if you're old enough to remember those, things that were like Facebook. Facebook is going to come along here, but also emails and, of course, later Twitter. So the government began to recognize that these were new means of communication. And you know, prior to this, the means of indirect communication were phone calls via landlines. and of course written letters. And there was a lot of case law and a lot of analysis that went into these areas. But as the 2000 rolls around, and then the 9/11 attack, the question is how much of this old law designed to handle things like snail mail, could be applied to something like email. And, do you treat it the same? And this is not necessarily a new thing. The same thing kind of happened in the 1920s when we shifted from a completely written communication system. Snail mail was somewhat replaced by telegraph, a little bit, but certainly also by phone. So the Patriot Act is passed. It allows greater monitoring of the American public, more government search and seizures without Fourth Amendment protections, more power to the chief executive. We also begin to see the start of mass surveillance. Computers allow us to really monitor large numbers of people because we can have the machines do it as opposed to the impossible situation of having to hire thousands and thousands of federal agents to read everybody's email. So we begin mass surveillance. And one of the questions becomes, okay, do you have an expectation of privacy, and when do you have this expectation of privacy? Do you have the same expectation of privacy and hence constitutional protections when you send an email as to when you send a regular mail, something through the mail? We begin to look at things like how much free speech should we allow on the internet, or how much can the government control it? Because you can look at it, again, two ways. You're free and you will surrender certain rights to the government to maintain your freedom, or the government will give you certain liberties. So you have to decide where you are. So one of the things is, do you have limits on the internet speech? And these limits can be imposed both from the left and the right. Primarily, we're looking at a rightist at this point, but you certainly could talk about leftist or politically incorrect speech, although that doesn't tend to be governmental. So do you limit internet speech? Things like, what about if terrorist groups like ISIS want to upload videos? What if they want to use the internet to proselytize? What if they want to use the internet to raise money? All of these are issues that have to be dealt with. Okay. Having said that, let's talk a little bit about this, to borrow a phrase, brave new world that we're in, this new cyber world. Clearly, computers and the internet have become central to society here in the early 21st century. Every business we can think of relies to some extent on computers to conduct its daily business. And the internet, particularly now, and I'm recording this during our quarantine lockdown, has become a place where we interact with people both commercially and socially. Now, any marketplace of ideas or economic marketplace can be exploited by the wrong people. So within this computer community, wrongdoing has an opportunity to flourish. And cybercrime is described as criminal activity that occurs inside this, let's call it a virtual world, virtual community. I do think, though, it's important to emphasize that most of these crimes that we can talk about exist outside the computer world. They may take different form, they may take unique application, I guess we could call it, but fraud has always existed, for example. Identity theft has always existed, for example. They're not necessarily new crimes. The way in which they're done might be seen as new. Okay, so talking about crime in the internet here, what are some of the cyber advantages? Well, here's a big one. It has allowed the dissemination of information that we have traditionally excluded from constitutional protection. So an extreme example of this would be child pornography. child pornography does not enjoy constitutional protection of freedom of speech. It is a type of speech, but the Supreme Court has long said that obscenities or pornography do not enjoy the same level of speech. Not everybody on the court necessarily agreed with that position, but that's the dominant position. So if we think about child pornography, in the past, before the internet, you would have to hire a model, a child model, or kidnap them, or use them. Then you would have to commit an actual act of sex with a child, film it, make copies of the film, and then distribute the film, if we were talking about a motion picture, if you will. But think about how that changes with the rise of the computer. You can create, for example, a completely graphical representation of a child. There's no real child, but you have a avatar, or you have a computer image, a CGI image, computer-generated image of a child. Or you can actually get a child and film it, clearly. Now you can set up a site for pedophiles to download this. There's no physical thing to attach to, and this site might be located outside of the easy control of the government or the police. So there is a clear advantage to the internet for people committing some of these crimes. It's fast, it's secure, and there's a greater degree of anonymity, where it's harder to know who's buying and who's selling. This leads to us to, we talked early in the class about the dark figure of crime that occurs that doesn't get reported. Well, this is a real problem for us in the internet. How do we determine how much cybercrime actually takes place? And unfortunately for that, there's really no answer. Okay, so as I said before, these are not new crimes. Most of these are existing crimes that the internet or the cyber community is now exploiting. So we have fraud. We recently have seen an explosion of fraud. For example, I was reading the other day, and I know this will make the lecture somewhat dated, about people who are selling online fake cures to the COVID-19 virus. You know, they're saying, oh, you know, buy this silver oxide. It completely gets rid of COVID-19. So you can commit these type of frauds over the internet. You can see catfishing or online dating scams. Cyber theft, and this is really broad. It's more than just identity theft and phishing, but let's just take identity theft. Yeah, stealing people's identification, then communicating with other people or other institutions, like I steal someone's identification and then communicate with his bank. That's been going on a long time. But the internet allows, again, that anonymity that really takes it kind of to a different level. A third type of cybercrime that exists outside is cyber aggression. There's always been physical stalking. There's always been bullying. There's always been libelous speech. But again, the internet allows us to do this online from the convenience of our own homes. If we look at the business world, hackers, and that term I think is getting a little dated. Hackers is now a very broad community, are people who use one computer to illegally access another. Now they can use all types of things. They can use viruses, they can use ransomware, they can use worms, and these all have very specific definitions. And of course in the future, I'm going to assure you that new types of techniques are going to be used to access it. One of the things going on right now, let's take the last one, the one that's not well defined in the slide, ransomware. We've seen several instances of hackers infiltrating computer systems, sometimes even police department computer systems, hospital computer systems, and then basically planting a virus or a worm that will shut down or erase those files, make the people that owns it unable to get them unless you pay money. And very often this is paid in Bitcoin or something that's untraceable or theoretically untraceable, and these can be extremely damaging attacks. several small governmental agencies in the United States, several important agencies like, as I said, police departments or hospitals have been subject to this. And that's kind of the newest crime that you see, and that's one that really didn't exist that much outside the world, the computer world. All right, pirating intellectual property. Most of us no longer, if we think about jobs that existed in the past, if we went back 200 years, okay, most Americans would be farmers because you needed a lot of farmers to produce the food we all ate. However, flash forward to today, and only 2% of Americans are involved in agriculture. So that means 98% of us are doing something else. Well, 100 years ago, we go back, a large section of those will be involved in making stuff in industry. 60, 70%. Flash forward to today, and a very small percentage of people are involved in actually building stuff. Mostly what we do is service and the creation of intellectual property. So intellectual property are really products that are created and the result of an intellectual process. So take something very famous like something many of you probably grew up reading or your siblings did, the Harry Potter books. J.K. Rowling made hundreds of millions of dollars writing those books, and then the movies made money, and then all these other things associated with it. That's more money, probably, almost certainly, than was made by most steel companies in the United States. So by creating a book and music and film and software, you're really creating something of value. And this is something, again, if something's valuable, people will try to steal it. And obviously people try to steal and pirate films and music and software and books, and this is of major concern to us because it is a larger and larger percentage of the economy. So how do we fight cybercrime? One of the things we can try to do is regulate the internet. I'm going to skip the 0-day problem and really jump to it. One of the things we try to do is encryption, blocking people so that only authorized people can get in. Now this is a double-edged sword, like much of this technology. So yeah, we can encrypt files to stop people coming in with malware. But that also might mean that someone using his iPhone famously for something illegal, who then locks or encrypts the data inside, we can't get in and see it. So encryption, one way that cybercrime is fought, and I will say that if you're looking for a career in law enforcement and you're looking for something as an entry, I think real deep knowledge of computing, either coding or some type of specialized skill inside it, could be very valuable to police departments in the future. So some of the challenges for law enforcement here, and this points out what I was just talking about, it can be difficult to gather evidence. How do you get the evidence you need if that evidence doesn't physically exist, it only exists in the internet? And then there's cyber forensics, and like I said, this is kind of an in for people that are thinking about a career in law enforcement. How do we use technology to detect these cyber crimes or physical crimes? And what about the digital evidence? So one of the things I tell my students is all of you are, if we use an analogy, fish swimming in an electronic sea. You interact with the internet constantly, whether you think about it or not. Every time you make a phone call, the location of that phone call, the duration of that phone call, who you made that phone call to, what tower it went through, where it went through, all of that is information that can be gathered, and that can be really valuable. Every time you do a digital search, a Google search, for example, and we've all had this experience, you do some searches, all of a sudden your feed and the ads become more tailored to you. And you begin to see, oh, I did this search for sriracha sauce, and all of a sudden, all my news feeds are giving me ads for coconut sriracha sauce or something. Well, you can see how this information, your searches are being kept. And that could be really valuable. There's an interesting case over in Durham where a man ran a search, depth of Carr Lake, and deepest part, something like that. And sure enough, he was planning on killing his wife. Killed his wife, dumped the body there. The police went back, managed to detect these searches, went to those areas, found the body. So that's cyber sleuthing, things like cloud computing, all very interesting. All right, let's talk a little bit about guns. A little bit of disclosure here. I am a gun owner, so I'm going to talk about it from my perspective as both a lawyer and as a gun owner. About a third of American households have at least one firearm. Now, interesting statistic, that number is falling. Fewer Americans own guns, and that's kind of, again, counterintuitive, and that's one thing I like about this course is we can talk about things that we assume to be true. Oh, everybody has a gun and people are buying more guns. Now, people are buying more guns, but fewer people are owning them, which means fewer people are owning individually more guns each. There are about 350 more, 360 guns in the United States. We are by far the most heavily armed civilian population on the planet. Now, the statistic there is accurate. There's about 32,000 firearm deaths every year. But you should pay attention to one thing. The most common firearm death is not going to be a murder or killing someone in self-defense. It's going to be a suicide if you look at broad categories. And that's kind of a mental health issue, like a lot of law enforcement issues are. Most gun owners are law-abiding. I consider myself a fairly law-abiding person. I own a gun. But illegally obtained firearms are a concern for law enforcement. About half of Americans want stricter measures of control over guns. And as I tell my friends who are a little bit more extreme gun owners, I tell them, look, I understand you don't want anybody registering your guns or telling you how many guns you can own or what type of guns you can own. But if you won't submit to some level of control, the rest of Americans, because remember, 2/3 of American households don't have guns, they're really going to at some point impose those restrictions against your wishes or controls. So the language of the Second Amendment comes into play here. And if you look at the language of the Second Amendment, it's pretty archaic and vague. There is a clause talking about an armed militia, and then it talks about the right of the people to bear arms. The Supreme Court has attempted to clarify this and has extended it. And I think this points out an interesting dichotomy that I point out to both my liberal and conservative friends. My liberal friends, some of them, believe in gun control. They think, oh, well, the Second Amendment's very antiquated. It refers to a militia. And the liberal approach to that would be, well, then we can regulate guns. And conservatives say, no, 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 no. You have to strictly interpret the Constitution, and you have to take a very broad interpretation and give the most rights you can, so there shouldn't be any regulation of guns. Well, when you talk about the First Amendment to those same groups, the First Amendment, talk to liberals, they'll often say, well, no, I don't want controls over the First Amendment. You should be able to express what you want. You should be able to say what you want when you want. For example, dissemination of pornography. On the other hand, conservatives at that point will say, well, no, you can regulate things. You can regulate speech if it's important for law enforcement. So, there is this tension here, and this goes back to a lot of these tensions. Some regulation at the federal, the state, and the local levels is allowable. What that is something that our society grapples with. And I would say that the court in the last 20 years has granted more gun ownership right than it had in the past. We do have some background checks. They're very weak compared to most other countries, but they do exist. They are limited, and there are exemptions in them. That's as much as I could say without going into a great deal of detail. Some of the issues we look at here, mental health. So we've had several shootings that seem to be triggered by, some we don't know, the famous Las Vegas shootings where the individual went up in a hotel room, just started shooting into a crowd. We have After studying that for more than a year or two, we have no idea why he did it. On the other hand, things like Sandy Hook, we have individuals who are clearly mentally disturbed and get their hands on a firearm and commit a crime. So the question is, how do you regulate that? Do you say anyone involuntarily committed, or maybe anyone that has a prescription for a mind-altering or a physical or psychological treatment of a mental disease should not be purchasing or possessing it? And this is a big issue. Individual states are trying to deal with this. Now, the Supreme Court in the last, as I said, 20 years really has wrestled with this and gone, I would say, more in favor of gun ownership than not, definitely. Okay, let's move on to white-collar crime. This is not an official category. It doesn't show up in the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report, a national incident-based reporting system, but it's clearly something that's very important. It involves illegal acts that include lying, cheating, and stealing, and those are kind of weird terms that are used. I would say fraud. Technically, financial activities characterized by deceit and concealment that don't involve physical force or violence. Usually, there's some separation. Usually, you at least behave legitimately. Example, several banks, Wells Fargo notoriously, committed fraud against their customers, and I'm using that term inexactly. They opened up accounts without permission or opened them out in violation of rules and regulations. We've seen instances of telephone companies or telecommunication companies charging fees they had no business charging or adding things to bills. And sometimes this is a very small amount from a very large number of people. You know, it's great if you can steal $1 million from a bank, but people are going to pay attention to that. If you can steal 1 penny from 100 million people, it might go undetected. And we do know that white-collar crime dwarfs. It is by far the largest type of property crime that occurs in the United States. So it often is based upon deceit, abuse of trust, concealment, conspiracy. It can be very hard to determine when it occurs. And as I said, very often individuals only have a very limited exposure to it. So let's take an environmental victim. It's expensive to dispose of some very dangerous toxic chemicals environmentally safely. So a white-collar criminal might say, okay, it's going to cost me $10,000 to process these chemicals and get rid of them legally. But tell you what I'll do. I'll just take this, and this happened in North Carolina, I'll just take these illegal chemicals, I will put them in my tanker truck, I will allow a little bit of it to leak out every second or two, and I will just drive that truck on the road until all those chemicals, and I think in this case, as I'm remembering correctly, they were PCPs, just a little bit of this will go into the environment. Now, nobody instantaneously dies. Those drops of PCP don't go in someone's lungs and bam, they're dead. But it is going to raise, and we're going to be able to see increased deaths, increased injuries, increased sicknesses among the general population, the society. So sometimes it's hard to point and say, there's the victim with a white-collar crime. It's difficult to regulate them. Corporations are treated as people, but you can't lock them up. Sometimes you will see violence by corporations. They can do things that actually result in real physical injury. Sometimes these are individuals that did it. There's cases, for example, of pharmacists who would substitute very expensive cancer-fighting drugs, and he would just put in placebos. Well, people died from that. That's an act of violence. If the corporation was aware of that, if, say, it was being done at a corporation, and it's not, let me emphasize that, I don't have any evidence that someone like Walgreens are doing it, that would be corporate violence. Much of the goal then is regulation. what you're trying to do is get people to comply, and this is a fight. Do you want to punish people you catch doing it? And that's really law enforcement. Or do you want people simply to comply and the crime not to occur? Now, that's probably the best thing, but it does tend to look like you're letting white-collar criminals get away with more crimes that way. Okay. We can look at some of the scandals, and here are a couple here. 2001, 2002, we have the famous Enron scandals. Then in 2008, we have the huge economic collapse we see from the subprime mortgage market. And the government winds up spending hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out the banking industry. And these scandals led to downturns, which led to more regulation and criminalization of crime, but they also led to physical injuries. We're seeing that now. We're in the midst of the corona epidemic. I wish it was corona, sorry. COVID-19 epidemic. As people get poor, they suffer. So people that lost their jobs because of the 2008 scandal or lost their job because of the Enron scandals, they might not have access to medicine, or they might not have access to jobs, or they might not have access to things that kept them alive. So poverty can kill. And if people are stealing enough from people, they can be committing violence remotely. Okay. That's about all I wanted to cover. As I said, this is a shorter unit. It's only about a half hour long. I hope you enjoyed the course. There is a review sheet for all of these terms, the reviews for the final. I think you should look at that, and I enjoyed teaching the course. I know we had some difficulty here switching over, and I hope to see some of you in the future. Goodbye.